yes, it's expensive to spend 40 billion a year on USAID, National Endowment for Democracy, all this stuff, but it works because you can control countries without having to formally annex them and formally have garrisons of troops, which is how the British Empire did it. And that is very, very hard to maintain for a long, long period. This liberal imperialism is actually much more stable because you just get proxy rulers who rule in your interests, get all the resources out, and create, as you said, police states across the Middle East. So the fact that there's a rupture now and he's going to this other type of imperialism, which is old school imperialism, I think it's going to hasten the decline of the American empire.
Hello everyone, I'm Rania Khalek and this is Dispatches. For decades, US imperialism has operated not just through military force, but through a vast, sophisticated system of economic coercion, media manipulation, and covert operations. Institutions like the World Bank and the IMF present themselves as tools for development, but in reality, they function as enforcers of American dominance, shaping the global economy in the interests of Western elites. Now, with Trump and Musk cutting USAID, some see it as a shift in policy, but in many ways, it's just a restructuring of the same imperial playbook. What does this tell us about the evolving strategies of empire? How does economic warfare, soft power, and media complicity allow the US and its allies to maintain global control with minimal backlash? And what role do the UK and other Western powers play in reinforcing this system, from aid-driven influence campaigns to direct military cooperation with Israel in Gaza? Joining me to discuss this and more is Matt Kennard, investigative journalist, co-founder of Declassified UK, and author of The Racket, a rogue reporter versus the American empire. But before we jump into it, this is just part of this episode. The full interview is available to Breakthrough News members only. You can become a member at patreon.com/breakthrough news. And as always, be sure to hit the subscribe button and the bell so you get a notification whenever we post new content. And if you appreciate this show, you can also donate below on YouTube. Matt, welcome to Dispatches.
Good to be here. Thank you for having me.
Well, it's fantastic to have you on. You've been doing fantastic, groundbreaking work, I would say, throughout the genocide in Gaza, which we're going to talk about, as well as, and we're also going to discuss your book, which is full of fantastic insight and reporting as well. I think a good place to start, because of what's happening in the news, is, and it kind of, feeds into some of what you wrote about in your book. I want to talk about the latest cutting by Trump and Musk of USAID. And, I believe ultimately, personally, this is just kind of a restructuring of imperialism. It's not like they're cutting off imperialism, but it's certainly brought to light some of the ways this very aggressive soft power mechanism through USAID was used to influence organizations and media, particularly in the UK, but also elsewhere. So given what you know about the way that soft power is used, I'm curious if you can talk a bit about your thoughts on what we've learned about just how much was getting funded by USAID, and what that actually means in terms of what it was being used for.
Yeah, well, I agree. It's kind of exposed the reality of liberal imperialism. This is the thing. So I agree with you that the imperialism is not going away. It's not like, in fact, Trump wants to just make it more explicit. But what it seems that he's doing is like cutting all the sort of propaganda bit of it. He's like, why do we even need to hide behind this liberal bullshit about spreading freedom and democracy and human rights? Let's just annex Greenland and annex Panama. And we spend billions of dollars on manufacturing consent for empire effectively around the world. We don't need to do that anymore. And interestingly, you mentioned a book. So the book was written mostly under the Obama administration, and I think it really is an analysis of liberal imperialism. And these institutions are part of liberal imperialism, which is the main way America has done it. So they spread their power through institutions, which they're telling the victims of these institutions are spreading good things and things that will benefit them. So USAID is one example, but there's also the National Endowment for Democracy, or Drug Enforcement Administration. These are institutions that you're told aid is about spreading money to poor people to develop. DEA is about stopping drugs. And NED is about democracy, but they basically do the opposite of what they say. And I found that quite explicitly on the ground. Like in Bolivia, which is the longest chapter in the book, USAID was funding all the opposition to Evo Morales soon after he got into in power in 2006. National Endowment Democracy was doing the same. Evo actually kicked out USAID in 2013. The Drug Enforcement Administration, which we're told is about like stopping drugs, when Evo kicked them out, drug production went down instantly. So you see that basically this whole ideological edifice has been created since the Second World War with all these different institutions, which I call the empire of acronyms. When you go to these countries in the global south, you go, especially in the smaller cities or capitals where they have one big high rise, and you go in and you look at the board, there's all these, it's like DEA, USAID, NED, there's a whole panoply of them. And also the multilateral institutions, or so-called multilateral institutions like the World Bank and the IMF, they're all part of the same tapestry. But what it does is it create an illusion of American power and sell the idea of American exceptionalism, which is deeply rooted all over the world. And I actually think one of the benefits of Trump is, and there's not many, because as you say, I think he's a brutal imperialist that has no regard for human life anywhere. But one of the benefits is it makes our enemy much clearer and kind of makes it harder for the liberal elite, which have got fat off this system, to justify it and defend it, which is why they're freaking out so badly. And just to go to your question about USAID and the defunding of it and what it's shown us, like it's even shocked me. For example, Reporters Without Borders had an article the other day with the headline, "Media in Crisis Around the World Because of USA Funding Cuts." And someone reading that would be like, wait, what? Why is media in crisis when you cut USAID? A lot of people outside don't even understand that the US was funding 9 out of 10 media outlets in Ukraine, which was in that article, which is shocking to me. I didn't realize that.
Yeah.
And then that's just USAID. So then NED probably funds the other 10%. So you talked about saturation, propaganda control of a country of 40 million people. That happens around the world. If you look into media outlets in the West as well, but in Latin America, Africa, and actually look at their funders, down the line somewhere they'll be funded by the US government or the UK government, many of them, often through fronts. And you can kind of tell by the complexion of their stories, they're often focused on official enemies, so Russia and Chinese influence. Mm-hmm. They'll be really obsessed with identity politics stories. There's a whole, it's very, very, the tone of it, you can instantly tell. And in fact, I was talking about this the other day, but there's an amazing book called Who Paid the Piper by Frances Stonor Saunders, who's a UK investigator and academic. She wrote this in the 90s, and it was all about the Cultural Cold War fought by the CIA. And I interviewed her for a story I did, and she said the Cultural Cold War didn't finish with the end of the Cold War. So all the things she was talking about, and she went deep into how the CIA basically had generated a whole discourse and culture in the West. Effectively, they funded abstract expressionism to give the idea of Western freedom as opposed to Soviet totalitarianism, etc., etc. But she said it never ended, and it carried on through institutions like the NED, USAID, and we live in that reality now. So I think smashing that reality and getting rid of the illusion that imperialism is liberal and spreading all these wonderful things, by the way, which was a tenet of British imperialism too. The British Empire was meant to be a liberal empire spreading wonderful things. In fact, its biggest advocates were people like John Stuart Mill, who's seen as the founder of modern liberalism. So we are in a new reality. There's definitely a rupture. Whatever you say about Trump, and I'm not a fan at all, he's a monster, but it is a rupture with what we've seen before. He's outside of the usual Democratic, Republican consensus on these issues. And one other thing, which I'll finish with, which I find really interesting, is that the liberal propagandists have kind of shot themselves in the foot, and the empire is self-destructing because of the power of liberal propaganda. Because Elon Musk tweets, I think earnestly all the time, we've been spending billions of dollars every year to fund radical leftists spreading their shit around, all this stuff around the world, and he believes it. And that's what the liberal New York Times has been telling him and everyone and Washington for years. And we all know it's rubbish before, but they don't. And they're actually dismantling this arm of the US empire, this soft power arm, thinking that they're doing it for left-wing reasons. I mean, for right-wing reasons, but actually they're really damaging the American liberal imperial project. What we'll see as a result of it, whether it will just be a turn to a much more hard-nosed imperialism, which is probably true, is an open question. But I do feel that type of imperialism is much easier to fight because they instantly lose the whole liberal elite that basically hold it up.
No, absolutely. I mean, what you're talking about, that sort of cultural hegemony that this massive apparatus has produced across the world, including in the global South. I mean, yeah, and even in the Middle East. I've lived in Lebanon for a very long time now. I've traveled across this region, and even in places where the U.S. has wrought nothing but destruction, right? And people recognize that. They recognize the horrors that the U.S. has committed. They still have this rosy view of the U.S. being this kind of like superior system. They internalize a lot of like the sort of colonial stereotypes that the U.S. projects onto the region as well, and kind of blame themselves for being deficient. The reason the U.S. is better and we're like this is because we're deficient, and that system is superior. And the U.S. is Hollywood, the U.S. is L.A., the U.S. is New York, the U.S. is D.C. It's so decadent and lovely, and it works. So that does matter. That's what the liberal imperialists have spent more than half a century pushing across the world in it, and it's worked to a significant degree. So once you start breaking that away, it does make a difference. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean, like you said, whatever Trump has in store, which is going to be more in your face, more depraved, will be something rosy, but they are destroying that liberal order. And it's so ironic because they're doing it in the name of like culture war. Like, we have to fight DEI. We got to stop giving food to these poor Africans. Like, that's what they see USAID as, right?
Yeah. And it's funny because like stuff I've been saying for years, and just has never been relevant to anyone, or completely marginalized, is now causing a global storm. There was one example recently. So I tweeted. I'd actually written about this before, but no pickup. I tweeted about how USAID were funding the charitable arm of the BBC, which is called BBC Media Action. Now, this is kind of a typical soft imperialism institution. It's the charitable arm of the BBC, but it works in up to 40 countries, teaching journalists how to report. But they're funded by the USAID, State Department. And I tweeted that they were the third largest funder of BBC. USAID was, and it went nuts. Elon Musk started tweeting about it. It got millions of views. It was going around the world. BBC had to release a statement like defending it. And I'm like, there's opportunities for us to raise issues that we've been talking about for years, because there's a space being opened up by Trump, not for the reasons that unwittingly, obviously, but I do think that holds potential for us. And as you say, this is I think the whole of the edifice it rests on the information war and the ideology, because once that unravels, it becomes very, very hard to justify, and you lose all the people you're talking about, and I agree with you, like when you go around the world, despite evidence to the contrary, many people are still in this idea that America is exceptional and interested in values rather than interests, and all this rubbish that you have to believe basically to work in the mainstream media and in top universities as well. But it's unraveling, and we should hasten it unraveling. And also the other thing is, if Trump wants to go to the more hard-nosed, straight imperialism without the propaganda, he might find that quite difficult as well on the ground, because even with his Gaza proposal, which is an example of this more hard-nosed imperialism, right, where he's just saying, right, we're going to kick him out and we're going to own it. He won't be able to. He's stupid. They've literally tried to depopulate Gaza for the last 16 months with a genocide. And I actually think that the original plan was to depopulate it from the Netzarim corridor just south of Gaza City, north, all of that, because they were doing showcases to get people to do settlements and stuff, and they did that extermination campaign in Jabalia Camp. You remember a couple of months ago?
Yes,
that was all. They were like we need to get these people out, and they refused, which is heroic as well. We don't talk enough about the Palestinians that stayed in northern Gaza. I'm not saying that the other Palestinians that moved are not heroic, but the fact that they stayed when they were told to leave and they knew they were being targeted by this genocidal war machine and they refused to leave, I think stopped the second Nakba. So the idea that Trump can just come in and say, we'll move them all out, yes, it's true that they could open the Rafah crossing if they got the agreement from Sisi, which is not, maybe won't be coming. But even if they did, I don't know if that would incentivize all the Palestinians.
So it's interesting. It's interesting because, just to build off what you're saying, and this kind of speaks to the irony of the way that the sort of Trump Musk, and I have to attach those names together because Musk is basically like part president right now in the US, but the way that their strategy works with the sort of like chopping off the US or the liberal imperialist arm to have this like more depraved in your face version, and actually that can backfire, right? Same goes with this, because now you have Trump threatening to cut off aid to Egypt and Jordan, because a red line for Egypt and Jordan, and I'll repeat this caveat, is it's not based on a love for Palestinians or really a care for what's happening to them. It's about their own ability to maintain power in their governments, their police states, and about having stability in their own countries. And having Palestinians ethnically cleansed in such high numbers into their countries is a non-starter for them. That is a red line. It's something that Biden could not sell to them. It's something that Trump has not been able to sell to them. So now Trump is saying, well, we're going to cut off aid if they don't abide by this. But they also need that aid to prop up their US-backed regimes.
Yeah.
So it's like, either way, whatever you do here, it's going to be completely destabilizing.
Yeah.
Obviously, we've learned that the destabilization of Gaza means nothing to the US-backed police states across the region. But if you actually push the destabilization into their countries, whether through cutting off aid or ethnically cleansing Palestinians or attempting to into their countries, it actually like dominoes your entire system of control over the Middle East.
And there's a reason that the Democrats and the Republicans have both overseen this so-called liberal version of imperialism, because it works. It works well, right? Yes, it's expensive to spend $40 billion a year on USAID, National Endowment for Democracy, and stuff, but it works because you can control countries without having to formally annex them and formally have garrisons of troops, which is how the British Empire did it. And that is very, very hard to maintain for a long, long period. This liberal imperialism is actually much more stable because you just get proxy rulers who rule in your interests, get all the resources out, and create, as you said, police states across the Middle East. So the fact that there's a rupture now and he's going to this other type of imperialism, which is old school imperialism, I think it's going to hasten the decline of the American empire, which is obviously happening. It's been written about a lot, but I think it should be welcomed. It's just that how awful the things have to get before liberation movements can actually throw out these US-backed police state rulers in the Middle East, and also how many Palestinians have to die because. I mean, the way they're talking about them is that's also very just sick to watch. You know, they're talking about millions of people in like their little bits of dirt on the street that they can just move around like willy-nilly. We'll just move them out, we'll own it. Like, I don't know, I've never come across leaders in the West talking about and being allowed to talk about people like this. It just goes to the heart of how dehumanized Palestinians are. And I know people talk about this.
No, it's like, it's what they say behind closed doors. Usually it kind of reminds you of that like Lawrence Summers quote from the 90s when he's like, let's just dump our trash in Africa.
Yeah.
Like, you know what I mean?
Yeah, and it's like Trump called shithole countries, you know. That's how they
yeah.
But to be honest with you, another thing about him that I think is welcome is he's just honest about it. He doesn't give the liberal niceties to these brutal racist imperial policies, and that's why another reason why the Democrats hate him and the sort of centrist Republicans, because he voices the reality of American imperialism which you're not allowed to do. Exactly. There was that interview where he said, "We've killed a lot of people." Do you remember? I can't remember, on Fox News or something. We killed people.
Yeah.
And everyone was like, "Oh shit, you can't say that in Washington." And he says like, "My favorite dictator is Sisi," or I can't remember if it was Sisi or MBS, but when he was last president, he's just honest about it. And that is, I welcome that.
Well, it's refreshing. It's refreshing when you're in like when your role is to be like is to be like exposing propaganda. It's like this makes my job
Exactly.
significantly easier.
Yeah. Exactly.
Um, I wanna bring it back to your book, but before I do, I also just wanna give you props for because you have been. I mean, your whole book is basically about this, but you have been covering this for a very long time. The use of aid. You recently tweeted out this article that you and Claire Provost wrote for Declassified UK. It was from 2023 May. It's titled How Britain Built a Second Empire Under the Cover of Aid. I mean, you're very, very good at basically breaking down the ways that this sort of soft power influence is dangerous. So I want to bring it back to your book because this
Yeah.
is basically what your book is about. The Racket
Yeah.
is all about the way these global elites manipulate economies and politics to basically maintain their power. And it challenges the idea that US imperialism is primarily enforced through war, which I think is important to
Yeah.
recognize. Like you said,
Yeah.
it's actually the way the system works is actually more beneficial for empire
Yeah.
because other people do the work for it. It just kind of funds it. So instead, you argue that the sort of economic coercion and political pressure do much of that work, and you detail how institutions like the World Bank and the IMF,
Yeah.
and even like USAID and others, act as the enforcers of this imperialism under the guise of economic development and aid, and that these institutions maintain that American dominance while pushing this illusion of aid. So I'm just curious, how does this more, let's say, subtle form of empire building, how does it maintain this control, but without provoking such a widespread backlash? Because that's why
Yeah.
it's so sophisticated and so effective.
Well, firstly, it's a system of exploitation and imperialism, but like all of them previously, they've had an edifice, an ideology built on top of them to justify it to the world and to the people that work within it. That's the other thing that I found reporting the Racket, because I was at the Financial Times at the time. So I was talking to people within the imperial system, US ambassadors or IMF people, and all of them, I believe, I get asked this question as well: do they believe it or are they evil? I believe that they ingest all the myths as well, because it's much easier to go to work thinking, if you work for USAID, thinking I'm spreading the wonderful benefits to the people I'm working with, rather than looking in the mirror and being like I'm a tool of the US empire. So I think for that reason, I think most people inside believe it. But but after the Second World War, when Britain handed the mantle of global domination over to the United States quite consciously knew that they weren't going to copy the British model. They were going to have to do it through more subtle means, economically subtle means as well. And that's why I don't think people can see it, because it's not like a garrison of troops in your city that walks around and if their leader does something they don't like, they just kill them or impose another ruler. It's much more subtle. But in the book I did in 2023 with Silent Coup about corporations, it was quite interesting because we went to the archives of the World Bank and the IMF in Washington, and you saw quite consciously that they were doing policy making to try and re-establish the imperial system, but without the formal mechanisms that they previously used to exert control. And the main way they did that was through a PR campaign around so-called development. So this idea that the World Bank and the IMF are concerned with development, and the poor world can benefit by getting IMF loans, by getting World Bank programs. But one of the mechanisms we looked into, which was kind of emblematic of the system, is called investor-state dispute settlement, which again no one knows about. But to go to your point about how does it get away with it, no one knows about this. But this is a system that facilitates the transfer of billions of dollars every year from the poorest countries in the world to the richest corporations. It's a system that was set up as part of the World Bank in the 50s, where corporations can sue states if they enact policies they don't like. So, for example, there's one case in Egypt where they raised the minimum wage and they were sued by a French water company for raising the minimum wage. They won that case. There's a famous case in Ecuador that Occidental Petroleum won billions from the Ecuador government for policies that weren't conducive to the oil company, Occidental Petroleum. It happens but it's a shadow system, so no one knows about it. Number one, the courts are highly secretive, so you can't get information. And that's how it works. The IFCs, the International Finance Corporation, another arm of the World Bank, which was created in the 50s. That's the private sector lending arm of the World Bank. That is about giving loans to non-commercial loans to the biggest corporations in the world to enter new markets, and they spend billions every year, taxpayer funded, giving cheap loans to companies, mining companies, diamond companies. I went to a diamond mine in Tanzania, which was funded by the IFC. So what it does is it puts every economy in the global south into a straitjacket, because the whole economy is based around, you need these loans from the IFC, the companies, to go in. You need to access IMF money if you're in a financial crisis. You need to go to the IMF. World Bank development programs are all based around foreign direct investment. That's the only way to develop. So it creates it's very, very hard to exit that straitjacket. And in fact, I find that the most interesting way to understand the system is when a government comes up that does try and break out, because then you see all the different pressure points. Because the system running as it should is great. You can't even see that this is an exploitative process, or at least you need to do a bit of investigation. But as soon as someone comes in who's trying to do something different, you see instantly that they have to kick out all these institutions that you're told are there for these beneficial things. I mentioned Evo Morales in Bolivia, and for me, it's a very, very emblematic case. And as I mentioned, it's the longest chapter in the book. I spent a lot of time there when I was at the FT. They didn't know about it, but uh, I was. But if you look at what Evo did, as I mentioned, he kicked out all these institutions. He nationalized the huge amounts of resources. He was hit by this investor-state dispute settlement system. He tried to leave ICSID, which is the body of the World Bank, which it's run through, and he was quite successful for 13 years, and then he was taken out in a CIA-backed coup. They tried to coup him in 2008. Actually, there was a US-backed coup, after which he kicked out the US ambassador. But to go to your point, which you made about violence is not their preferred way of doing it, the Americans, that is very true. There's stages to this imperial system. So firstly, they hope that they've created a democratic system that won't be tampered with by the social order, won't be tampered with by the majority of people, and in fact, that's why democracy was allowed to be restored in Chile in 1990 after 17 years of dictatorship. They basically destroyed the society so much, and the ability of people to have any say in their society, that democracy was fine. Even if you get some centre left or centre right, they're basically not going to tamper with the social order. So that's how it works when it's working, which is often does. Then if someone gets elected like Allende or Morales, then you bring in the sort of NED, USAID, and you start funding the opposition. And then you bring in the CIA and start instigating, in Chile,
Protest, violence.
exactly. Well, in Chile, they did the truckers' strike. Do you remember, like that? And they stopped movement. And they did exactly the same thing in Bolivia in 2008. Actually, there was a secessionist movement. They tried to get them to cede, and then they stopped all the trucks being able to move. And then you make the central government unpopular. People come out on the streets. Someone might get shot. Then you say that this is, but that didn't work.
The dictatorship, a police state, they're killing
Exactly.
their people, like that
Exactly.
sort of thing. Yeah.
And then if that doesn't work, then you bring in the military as a last resort, but the Pentagon budget is like $1 trillion a year. But that's not just the US military. There's many, many intelligence parts of that and subversion parts of it. So it's a whole tapestry. And actually, to go to your point about it, the Racket, the title comes from a speech by General Smedley Butler, who died the most decorated Marine in US history, and was signed up to the American military in 1898, which is when a lot of historians put the start of the external US empire, because they beat the Spanish in this 3-month war, which started in Cuba. And then having won that, they took on a bunch of Spanish imperial possessions. And for the first time, there was a big discussion within America about, should we become an empire? And that's when the Anti-Imperialist League started, which had some really, Andrew Carnegie was part of it, and other, like, it was a very sort of interesting assortment of people. But basically, they lost. The discussion was lost, and the imperialists won out, and it continued from that point. But Smedley Butler fought in all the, there's this whole thing, and you probably, if you went to university in the States, you put Wilsonian idealism, which is this guy, Woodrow Wilson, as his presidency was extremely idealistic, mainly because of his plan during the First World War. But it doesn't. But during that period, they intervened so many times in Central America, like Honduras.
Yeah.
They invaded Haiti in 1915 and took all the gold. It was just to ransack the country. Guatemala. So he was fighting in all these wars, and he fought in the Boxer Rebellion in China. But when he left, he had a awakening about what he'd been doing inside the US military. And this is why the passage from his speech that he gave, where he describes this, is at the start of the book, because I think it describes very clearly what I saw inside the FT and what most of us who look into this can see, which is that he said, I wasn't in these places like Honduras or China for to protect US national security interests or to protect anything to do with the American people. I was there to protect Brown Brothers Bank in New York. I was there I was a high class muscle man for big business. That's what he said. Al Capone operated in 3 districts. I operated in 3 continents.
Yeah.
I was a racketeer for capitalism, and I think that that's right. I don't think it's ever changed. I think that basically the Pentagon budget and the US military and these intelligence services, it's wrong to think of them as national security or defense, which is why they call themselves that, because they want to put the propaganda out. But the reality is that they are the armed wing of US corporate power, and they will come in to enforce US corporate power. The other part of it is geopolitical control, which is important. But those 2 things obviously chime, because you don't often get a country that is under the geopolitical control of the United States that doesn't open its economy up to its corporations. Those things are joint. But the whole edifice is to create states that basically they're just clients, they're vassal states, they can't, and they have a democratic system that does not allow for liberatory leaders to rise up, and if they do, they will be destroyed. We had an occasion like that in the UK with Jeremy Corbyn. That's to go off on a tangent, but interestingly, when we started Declassified UK, I thought that maybe the UK was outside of this sort of global South program, but you realise that the reason we haven't had a anti-imperialist prime minister or even Labour leader before Corbyn was because our country is also controlled by these institutions we're talking about. The National Endowment for Democracy gives grants to media here. The CIA has 1,000 spies at one so-called UK base in England. The NSA runs GCHQ, which is our largest intelligence agency. It has a site in Cornwall. Half of its upkeep is paid for by the NSA that came out in Edward Snowden. So you realise that it's the global north is under the control of the United States as well.
100%.
So there's a saturation control, and then and then the rest, and then the rest of it is it's just propaganda. So no one and the media don't cover it. Like, for example, we have 12,000 troops, US troops in this country now, and that figure, people know that there's US.
How's that occupation going?
Yeah, it's great. It's great. I love it. But that figure's never been in the UK newspaper. You would think maybe once people might be interested to know that there's like a foreign military occupying our country. It's crazy. But for me, that this is the scariest thing about the US empire, is that the control that they have now. I don't know if it has got worse in recent decades, but the control over the media and civil society. And you see that very clearly. I'll finish with this, but
everywhere.
Yeah, but like
everywhere.
Here we're having like a major crisis of democracy with attacks on independent journalists like Asa Winstanley, Richard Medhurst, Sarah Wilkinson, Natalie Strecker. There's a whole list of them who are being raided, arrested, charged under terrorism. Not those 4 people I mentioned, and there's more. Not one single word has ever appeared in the mainstream media about these people getting raided. I'm talking about including in The Guardian, in any paper. And you're sort of like, for me, that's scarier than the raids and arrests themselves, because the public realm in the UK, and it doubles up for Europe, lies completely undefended. The whole thing we're told, which is that civil society, the media will defend these principles of democracy, freedom of press. They don't exist, and they've all been captured by the US government. And another example of that was the Julian Assange case here, which basically was memory holed by the whole media as well. So it's.
I mean, even with, I know it didn't happen in the UK, but even with Alia Bounima, like getting arrested and detained for 2 days in Switzerland, not a single major media outlet, except for like Al Jazeera, but it's Qatari funded, so of course, and it's like pro-Palestine, not a single media outlet that technically matters in the West. It's considered the reliable source, the one with all the funding and the one with the huge staff. No one covered it.
Don't you find that scary? I saw your tweet about that. Like, that is like, when they come for any of us, that we're not defended. All these wonderful things they say we have, they don't exist, and that is kind of shocking. because and as I say, like, you don't usually see these pressure points. You don't see the reality. You don't see the actual barriers until the system has to really expose itself when the situation gets out of control, which it has here because Israel's losing the narrative war, which is why they're arresting these. And then they have to say, well, fuck all that. Oh, sorry, I shouldn't swear, but
No, that's
all,
epic.
all that,
Say how you
all
feel.
that propaganda we got, we haven't got time for it anymore. We don't live in a democracy. There is no freedom
It's
of press.
it's like psychological warfare on the entire world because also like one of the most propagandized populations in the world is also the American population.
Mm.
I mean, it's a country where it's just like so many layers of propaganda where you have so much inequality, so much misery, and it's so obvious who's doing it, but they control all the means of information and communication.
Exactly.
So there's people who can't afford an ambulance and like have two jobs, but like they're told to hate Mexican or
Yeah,
like Guatemalan, El Salvadorian immigrants and like blame them and then blame like DEI.
yeah.
Um, and then on top of that, they still believe they can be Elon Musk one day. And it's like,
But it's like
it's
you say.
incredible. And also I'll add to that, like the other layer of it too is like, and not, I know this is not something you really get into, but I always find it so striking how, I mean, one of the most popular families in America is our Kardashians, this billionaire family that has a TV show that's like fake reality. And they have so many fans, and their show is literally about flaunting their hoarded and gated wealth.
Mm.
And people are like, oh my God, they're so amazing. And I'm like, they literally just hoard their wealth, don't pay taxes, and have a show to convince you they're amazing and make more money. And it works. But
Yeah,
anyways,
no, it's true, and but it's like it's quite simple why we're heavily propagandized to consent to this system. It's like in the Soviet Union when Pravda, which was the party line paper, people writing that and reading that knew that they were getting the party line because structurally it was very clear, you know. Whereas in our society, we expect to get the truth about how corporate-run society works from the corporate-owned media. It's just you're not going to get the truth when all
no.
the whole information system is dominated by corporations who have a very clear interest in, like you say, dividing people based on race, whatever it is, and also obscuring the reality of how our so-called democratic system works, which is effectively just like you can pick two factions of the same corporate party, and it's the same in the UK. Corporations have completely colonized the political system in the US and the UK and lots and everywhere around the world. It's it, I you know there's this conception of state and corporate power are two adversarial power centers and they duke it out. It's completely wrong, and this was another thing that I got from reporting that book Silent Coup, because you realize that they are not separate, that the state has been completely colonized, and even the powers that the state does officially operate, they're often done in the interests of corporations anyway. So there is no, like when I was going around the world for that book and reporting from Colombia or Tanzania or wherever it was and talking to poor people on the ground, which I did a lot of, like peasants who'd been displaced by corporate projects and blah blah blah. It was quite a profound experience because I'd often say to them, like, I understand why yeah, the corporations doing this. I mean, for bad reasons, obviously, but they want your resources and they want your land. But you are a part of a society. You have a government which is meant to represent you. And so, what's your government doing to help you against this corporation? And honestly, they thought that was a mad question. They would always say to me, what do you mean the government? The government works for the corporation. For them, it was obvious. And that's what you see all the time is like governments are basically vehicles to grease the entry of corporations into that country and take the resources with as few impediments as possible. So few taxes, few customs. And in fact, Evo Morales, I know I keep talking about him, but I think that it's a very, very important case for anyone, any progressive, because for me, I think in terms of the um, sustained experiment in democratic socialism, that might be the most successful one in history. I don't know of a one that was sustained over 13 years. And in fact, they're still in power. They also overturned the CIA coup, which I've never seen happen before the following year. But anyway, when I did a story about the UK role in that coup in 2019, and Evo Morales invited me to his house in Bolivia, and I interviewed him. He was talking about what he did when he came in, and he was saying when I came in, the corporations took 83%, and Bolivians had 17%. And the first thing I did was reverse that. And I was like, why did it take? It took 500 years for them to for someone like this to come along, because the Spanish had been in control, and then the Americans since
Right.
Spanish. But that very simply, that's what you have to do. And you have to renegotiate the contracts, cancel the contracts, nationalize the resources, and that's what you're told not to do by the IMF and
And
World
not
Bank.
get killed. And not
And
get killed
exactly,
while
and the other
doing
point
it.
is,
Yeah.
when you do that, you instantly step on the toes of the empire. And another example is Hugo Chavez, who's a very interesting case. Was elected in 1998, but there was a CIA-backed coup in 2002, and he became a lot more harsh in his rhetoric against the United States, rightly, after 2002. But people used to say to him, like, why do you hate America? And he said, I don't hate America at all. But if you want to do what I'm doing, i.e., give the resources of my country to the people who sit on top of those oil reserves, you cannot do it without stepping on the toes of the empire. It's impossible to go this course without becoming the enemy of Washington, and that's just the way it is. And you have to kick out. I believe to have a sovereign country, you have to do whatever did Hugo Chavez do: kick out USA, kick out NED, kick out the DEA. They're not there to help you. They're there to enforce and dominate Washington's power. So it's very, very important, and in fact, it's happening around, like in North Africa now. There's quite a few interesting. There's three
Mm-hmm.
governments just left ECOWAS, which is this US backed coalition, and they're nationalizing resources and stuff. This is the red line that the empire just hates, is if you use the resources of your country for your people. There's such a long history of this, from Mossadegh in Iran in 1953, which is a joint US UK backed coup where they took him out. Just it was so like he nationalized the oil company, the Anglo-Persian oil company, which became BP, and then 2 years later he was couped in a joint CIA MI6 operation. The following year in Guatemala, Jacobo Arbenz, who was just distributing a little bit of land to the peasants from the United Fruit Company. Well, the United Fruit Company got in contact with the CIA, and they took him out and installed a brutal dictatorship. There was a genocide in the 80s. Like this history is buried, but it shows how the world really works, and it shows that the
Oh,
US is
yeah.
the central player.
No, it's incredible. I mean, literally the entire system that we have is so parasitic, and it's based on empowering and enriching a small group of ruling elites through the US empire. And if you choose to try to not give your resources away for almost free,
Yeah.
then you will face those circumstances. I want to ask you on the media side of things, because you've mentioned a few times about being at the Financial Times. I'm actually going to quote you from your book. You write, a couple of years after my initiation at the Financial Times, a few things started to become clear. I came to realize a difference between myself and the rest of the people staffing the Racket, the United States Agency for International Development Workers, the Economist in the International Monetary Fund, and so on. While I was coming to understand how the Racket really worked, I started to see them as willing dupes. There was no doubt they seemed to believe the virtue of the mission. They imbibed all the theories that were meant to dress up global exploitation in the language of development and progress. I saw this with American ambassadors in Bolivia and Haiti, and with countless other functionaries I interviewed. They genuinely believe the myths, and of course are paid handsomely to do so. I help, or I'm sorry, I'm like not able to read because I'm getting old. To help these agents of the Racket get up in the morning, there also exists throughout the West a well-stocked army of intellectuals whose sole purpose is to make theft and brutality acceptable to the general population of the US and its racketeering allies. So the reason I wanted to quote you saying this is because I want you to elaborate a bit on these delusions that they tell themselves and kind of the psychology you witness behind this. I think it's always so interesting how a character like you can come out seeing the reality and just being actually radicalized by it. But that's an exception. For the most part, people either get what's going on and they just kind of like understand where they're being paid from and they go along with it even if they don't believe with it, or they really buy into it so they can sleep at night.
Yeah, it is. It's an interesting question. I mean, to be honest with you, I was pretty much thought the same things that I do now when I went into the FT, which is why I think I managed to resist it. But it was an interesting experience because I was kind of aware of. I went in with actually some really good journalists that actually thought quite critically as well, but I think some of them are still there. But uh, the way it works is it's insidious. You know, it doesn't work in an explicit way. No one's telling you what to write. No one's telling you you have to say certain things, but yet everyone ends up thinking the same sort of thing. The way I've thought about this a lot, I think it's just the process of a culturalization of co-option, and the way and if you are outside that, or you see evidence that uh, uh, contradicts it, and you maintain that, it's basically impossible to operate in any institution for 20, 30 years if you think differently to everyone else. Firstly, personally and on a psychological level, but also the institution itself will eject you at some point, which is what happened to me. But I think that what no one is thinking I'm becoming a neoliberal U.S. empire propagandist. Everyone's thinking, well, no, in fact, I don't even think it. I think the whole system works subconsciously. I think people just become part of. You just start not thinking certain things. And I always use this example, but it is quite interesting. It's like, and it's illustrative because it generalizes across a lot of different topics. But if you're at the FT, for example, you would, every time you mention Hezbollah, you'd write Iranian-backed Lebanese militant group. But if you're writing about Saudi Arabia, you don't write US-backed Wahhabi extremist dictatorship. Both things are true, but there's certain things that you say about official enemies that are always included, and certain things that are always elided when you're talking about allies. Now, no one's ever taught you that. No one said you can't write US-backed, but literally, it would be
You just
impossible
know.
to think it inside the FT. And in fact, when I left, or when I was close to leaving, I was like, I'm going to start including this stuff anyway. Let's see what happens. And actually, it's explicitly taken out. It was taken out. But the point is that was only right at the end, and that was really extreme. The point is, no one ever thinks it. And there was another occasion when there's a section of the FT called House and Home, which only very loyal, dedicated readers of the FT will know. But it's basically a supplement on the weekend where you go and interview it's about rich people's houses, but one of the features is you go and interview a rich person about all the wonderful stuff that they have in their house. None of it which I would understand, but when I was there, I was like, that was when Occupy London Stock Exchange was happening, and I said to
Yeah.
the editor, I was like, look, why don't we do one with someone living in a tent outside the London Stock Exchange? And he was like, all right, go on then, do it. And then I went. You can find it online. Like I went and interviewed this guy, this like 25-year-old from up north who was living in a tent and then the photographer came down and took pictures of him in his tent, and like it was completely outlandish for the FT. And journalists would say to me, "I can't believe they published that." And I was like, and I said to them, "Have you ever asked to write something like that?" I said, "No, no, I've never thought about it."
I
And
wouldn't
that's
think
how,
to. Yeah.
yeah. So, but I think that's how it works, and that's also how the propaganda works in the West generally is propaganda by omission. So at the
Right.
FT, I was taught, and it is a very good paper. The facts are correct because people invest based on the information. There's a higher premium for getting things right. But so they're not actively lying, but what they're doing is they're leaving out and eliding all the information you need to have a proper understanding of how the global economy works, how the US empire, you can't even use the word US empire, for example. You can use the word Chinese imperialism or Russian, but you can't use it on you. And the whole system operates, I believe. The principal propaganda mechanism is propaganda by omission, just leaving out. And the beauty of it is no one even needs to tell them what they should leave out. They just do it
Right. They
by
just
they've learned
know.
internally, subconsciously. They know what can and can't be written, and it's a beautiful system, and it only is exposed more and more now because of alternative media, because of people like us,
Yeah.
people like who access information from Twitter and Facebook or whatever it is. Are like, why the F am I not getting this from the mainstream media, including and particularly over Gaza, right? Like all the
Yeah.
only we got so much information from the heroic journalists in Gaza that we just would never have seen if we'd relied on the mainstream media. So I do think this whole system is crumbling, and the reason that they are so the polling shows how little trust there is now in places like CNN and BBC compared to before, and that's because they actually are getting outflanked by independent
Mhm.
journalists and social media. Their bullshit is getting
Yeah.
exposed.
And our budgets don't even compare to what they've got, you know? It's
Madness!
so
It's
it's
madness.
yeah, it just speaks to like how I don't know, just how how much more difficult Gaza has made it to cover up because of exactly what you're talking about. And that's a good segue into Gaza, because I wanted to ask you about something that the outlet you write for, and helped co-found, UK Declassified, or Declassified UK, sorry, has been crucial to uncovering. And that is these British spy flights to Gaza. And also this British spy squad that was basically helping gather intelligence for Israel's destruction of Gaza. There was also a component of US special operations using those spy flights. This got, like, you kind of picked out times like where it was noted in the New York Times, like here or there, but for the most part, this was largely ignored. As this was like, and this was also crucial to helping this genocide be carried out. So can you talk about what were these British spy flights? Why did they matter? What is this British spy squad, and what was the involvement of US special operations in any of this?
Yeah, well, it does link to what we were just talking about, and it has, this again has shocked me because the stories we were doing at Declassified created a major scandal in Cyprus, which is where a lot of this activity was happening. There's 2 UK bases there, and weekly protests at one point at RAF Akrotiri, which is the airbase, and the city next door, which is Limassol. The presidents of Northern Cyprus and the Republic of Cyprus having to make comments in press conferences when asked about it. Not a single word about any of it, literally not a single word, has ever appeared in the UK newspaper. And so, which is shocking and it's propaganda by mission, but it's also bloody scary, because you just realize, like, we're living in a hyper reality created by mainstream media, which just does not tell us how anything works. But to start at the beginning of this story, and it's a long story. I won't go into all the different elements, but basically, my conclusion is that this was Gaza was a tripartite genocide, in that the US provided the majority of the arms, the UK provided the majority of the intelligence, and the Israelis got it done. So it was a three-way thing, and in fact, Al Jazeera followed up on some of our work in an investigative piece, and they found that 47% of the reconnaissance flights flown over Gaza during the genocide were flown by the RAF, the British Air Force. That's more than double Israel itself. So you're talking about a participation in the genocide, which is huge. Wow. And it's never been written about. But anyway, this has all been done from a base on Cyprus called RAF Akrotiri, which is also a joint US base, by the way. Not officially, but it is. Early on in the genocide, I started seeing on flight tracking websites, because the Ministry of Defense wouldn't tell me how many flights were going to Israel. I started seeing on these flight tracking websites that daily C-17 and A-400 military transport flights were going to Israel. These are huge vehicles that can carry 150 troops, Black Hawk helicopters, Abrams tanks. 48 of those went up to January. We still don't know what was on those, because the Ministry of Defense, when they've had to defend it, and as I said, the media's never asked them, but when they had to defend it to me, they would say it was taking medical supplies and moving ministers. But that's rubbish. There's no way you'd need 48 of these massive things. So they were going, and then the SAS, which is the UK Special Forces, also deployed to Cyprus. That was leaked in the media. Obviously, it was heroic SAS going to help rescue hostages. That was leaked to the Sun newspaper on October 27th. On October 28th, the Ministry of Defence sent out a D-notice, which is a censorship notice to all media, to say you can't publish anything about the UK Special Forces and their role in Gaza. Since that day, we don't know anything that the UK Special Forces were doing in Israel or in Gaza. We don't know.
If you enjoyed this episode and want to hear the rest, you can access it by becoming a Breakthrough News member at patreon.com/breakthrough news.